At exactly 6:40 in the morning on the 1st of June, the village of Kana still lingered beneath a veil of mist. The wind rustled softly through the leaves. Elders were stoking morning fires. Children, still deep in dreams, curled beneath thin blankets. It was a morning like any other in southern Burkina Faso along the border with Côte d'Ivoire, a region known only by sighs and whispered fears. That's where the terrorists go. But that morning, the sky carried more than just light. A thunderous screech shattered the calm. A streak of fire tore through the heavens, and in seconds, a steel bolt descended upon a hidden camp in the dense Kana forest. The explosion lit the trees like a blaze in dry season. Iron twisted, tents crumpled. Cries pierced the morning air only to be swallowed by silence moments later. That strike was not simply a military operation. It was a declaration. A line drawn in fire and smoke. The era of helplessness had ended. Burkina Faso had awakened. Since the day Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed command of the armed forces, the nation had quietly, yet fiercely reshaped its fight. No longer passive, no longer waiting. Under his command, soldiers didn't just defend, they pursued. And every step forward was taken with intent, not hesitation. As one commander put it, we don't just hold ground now, we reclaim dignity. The 15th Battalion stationed near Kana led the first thrust of this new offensive. Intelligence gathered from local volunteers and aerial surveillance had confirmed a large militant group crossing over from Côte d'Ivoire, believing as they had for years that the southern border was weak unwatched. They were wrong. At precisely 7:20 a.m., as the group entered a clearing fringed with tall grass, unaware of what lay in wait, the signal was given. A crackling whisper over radio began. Gunfire erupted from both flanks. The ambush, swift and merciless, lasted no more than 11 minutes. 7 militants lay dead. A truck loaded with weapons was seized. The rest scattered into the brush, their formation broken, their confidence shattered. But this wasn't a stroke of luck. It was the opening move of what would later be called the 48-hour counteroffensive. Captain Traoré had issued the order days before. Don't just strike their camps. Strike their belief in safety. Strike their rhythm, and let them know we are watching. Up above, drones buzzed silently, relaying heat signatures and movement back to Ouagadougou. Red zones lit up on digital maps. One region after another where insurgents had once gathered freely was now being hunted. That very night, the 9th Battalion was mobilized toward the Tabarka woodlands, a known smuggling corridor. Through the marshes and under thick canopy, they moved without light, breathing with the land, listening for the crunch of careless feet or the murmur of whispered plans. Just before sunrise, they found them 3 trucks idling in a grove, engines still warm. Fighters were chatting quietly, their rifles slung loosely. There were no warnings. Only the sudden burst of disciplined gunfire. In minutes, the trucks were ablaze. Survivors tried to flee, but all exits had been blocked. Later, a young soldier picked up a faded scarf from the ground, holding it as he murmured, "They didn't have time to set traps this time. They were the ones being hunted." But perhaps what truly shifted the nation's spirit was not the number of dead or the weapons seized. It was the clarity, the confidence, a feeling the people hadn't dared speak aloud in years. We can win. In Kana, people began hanging lanterns outside their homes again, something they had stopped doing fearing night raids. Children kicked footballs on dry earth near the well. One mother Awa looked up at a plane overhead and whispered, "For the first time, the sky makes me feel safe." And amid the smoke still rising from that morning's strike, the first entry was written in the field journal of the Operation Kana strike, concluded at 8:03 a.m., operation underway. But this was only the first day. They no longer chase us. Now, we chase them. Those were the words whispered by a soldier from the 9th Battalion as he crouched behind a tree line at dawn, eyes fixed on the forest ahead. That morning in Seno was thick with dust and tension. But his voice held no fear, only a quiet resolve that spoke of change long overdue. Just 2 days into the 48-hour offensive, the rhythm of war had shifted. What had once been a scattered, cautious defense had now become a hunt. And in Seno, a region where the enemy once passed through unchallenged Burkina Faso's forces were no longer waiting. They were moving. It began near Tabarco, a dry belt of terrain where trees grew sparse and shadows cast long lines across the cracked earth. The 9th Battalion had been dispatched under the cover of night, guided by fresh intelligence. A supply convoy had been spotted, 3 trucks lightly guarded, but carrying vital equipment and ammunition. By 4 in the morning, the troops were in position. No one spoke. Even the birds had fallen silent. As the first truck came into view, headlights flickering through the dust, a silent signal passed from one soldier to the next. Then came the order, "Hold now." Gunfire cracked like thunder. It lasted less than 6 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the convoy had been reduced to charred metal. The few who tried to run found nothing but more fire waiting ahead. Further north in Solimana, a different unit from the 10th Battalion was conducting a routine patrol. What they didn't know was that a band of militants had chosen that same path for a late-night crossing. The 2 groups met in silence, eyes locking just before the first bullet flew. The firefight was fast, brutal, and close, yet the soldiers held the line. When the sun finally rose, not only had the attackers been pushed back, but one of the stolen vehicles used in a previous ambush had been recovered. The same vehicle a village elder once described as the truck that took our sons. These weren't just victories measured in bodies or bullets. These were personal reckonings. In a small home outside Solimana, an old woman named Mariam wept as she watched a convoy of soldiers pass through her village. Not tears of sorrow, but of release. She stood on her porch clutching the photograph of her husband killed by insurgents 3 years earlier. Her voice trembled as she spoke to a young officer who stopped to greet her. "You are the first to come through this village without fear in your eyes. That gives me peace." Under Captain Traoré's reforms, each battalion operated with newfound clarity. The old delays requests sent and ignored commands lost in bureaucracy had been replaced by direct, disciplined action. Every move was backed by real-time intelligence. Every strike had purpose. Soldiers were no longer guessing, they were executing. And they believed. For years, the fight against terrorism had felt like trying to hold back a river with bare hands. Borders were porous. Attacks came without warning. Civilians lost faith not just in the military, but in the very idea of protection. But now, even the enemy seemed shaken. Reports trickled in from other regions, Sandomani Gibo. Militant movements that once appeared swift and confident now seemed scattered. Supply lines disrupted, camps abandoned. Fires smoldered where once meetings were held. The success of the second day of the campaign wasn't just in the body count, it was in the rhythm of resistance. Villagers whispered about the change. Markets reopened. Fences long broken were rebuilt. Parents, for the first time in months, let their children play beyond the thresholds of their homes. At dusk, as soldiers gathered near a makeshift fire at the edge of Seno, one young recruit asked his sergeant, "Do you think this will last?" The older man looked toward the horizon where the stars were beginning to peek through the smoke-stained sky. "If we keep moving forward like this," he said quietly, "it will." That night, somewhere deep in the forest, a drone passed overhead. Its eye unblinking, hovered above a clearing where footprints in the dust told of hurried retreat. Fires still burned low where an abandoned camp had stood. The enemy had fled. But this time, they left behind more than weapons. They left behind fear, no longer held by villagers, but by themselves. And the hunt was just beginning. In the heart of the Gibo forest, beyond the last known trail, and beneath the canopy of ancient trees, there stood a compound silent, deep, and well guarded. The men inside believed it impenetrable. Their maps marked it as Peg Lee, a name whispered only among the highest ranks. It was more than a shelter. It was a nerve center, a hidden throne from which plans were drawn and destruction spread outward. But what they didn't know was that the sky sees all. And this time, it remembered. On the third day of the counteroffensive, a drone silent and unassuming circled high above the treetops. It hovered, watching, confirming. Inside the compound below, men sat around maps, radios, and crates of ammunition. Their voices were calm, confident. But their calm was misplaced. At 14:17 hours, confirmation came from Ouagadougou. Coordinates locked. Target verified. Strike authorized. In the seconds that followed, the sky cracked open. A guided missile, honed with precision and directed by satellite intelligence, fell like judgment. It struck the roof of the Peg Lee compound with surgical force. The entire structure folded inward like a house of cards. Smoke billowed skyward, thick and dark, curling into the trees like a ghost being exorcised. Those who survived the initial blast stumbled into the open only to be met with a second wave, smaller drones releasing smaller payloads. Not to destroy, but to dismantle hope. Back at base, a voice came across the radio command post, neutralized. Peg Lee is silent. But the assault didn't stop there. Just south of Gibo, in a thick forested ridge near Surgisuma, another target had been identified, a logistics base believed to house fuel weapons and encrypted communication gear. By the time night fell, that base too had become embers. The jungle that once sheltered insurgents now held only ash. Each strike was precise, each strike intentional. Under Captain Traoré's doctrine, air power wasn't a display, it was a message. The era of random retaliation had ended. This was war with eyes open, with maps in hand, and justice guided by intelligence. And still perhaps the most haunting blow was yet to come. At Peg Lee, a survivor, a high-ranking insurgent was pulled from the wreckage 2 hours later, badly burned, delirious. As medics treated him in the shadows of the ruined compound, he mumbled over and over, "They found us." How did they find us? That question would echo in enemy camps across the region for days to come. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the news traveled differently. In homes and markets, the name Peg Lee meant little. But the story behind it, the hidden place struck down the silent eyes in the sky, the men who could no longer hide, meant everything. In a small radio broadcast that evening, a former soldier turned journalist told the tale in simple words. Today the forest remembered what it means to belong to its people. In a village near Dori, a group of boys stood by a cracked radio listening in silence. One of them, no more than 10, turned to his grandfather and asked, "Is the war almost over?" The old man, eyes glistening, replied, "Not yet. But it's walking toward its end, step by step." Elsewhere, on a crumpled wall, once marked with bullet holes, someone had chalked a message in white, "The sky does not forget." That evening, as the stars rose once more over Gibo, the jungle lay still. But this time the stillness was not one of fear. It was of reckoning. They gathered by the hundreds. Deep within the forested heart of the tri-border zone, where Burkina Faso meets Mali and Niger, a massive swell of militant movement had begun. Like shadows slipping between trees, they came with weapons, with supplies, with purpose. For days they had planned a large-scale assault. Maps were drawn in dirt. Commands passed in hushed tones. The trees, thick and ancient, stood witness to the quiet unrest. But the trees were no longer the only watchers. High above, where no leaf could shield and no whisper could hide the eye in the sky, lingered. A drone, small unblinking, had spotted the gathering. At Central Command in Ouagadougou, the feed was chilling. Over 1,000 heat signatures clustered tightly in a clearing. A concentration like this had not been seen in years. For the militants, it was meant to be strength in numbers. For Captain Traoré, it was a gift. The order came without hesitation. At precisely 10:42 a.m. on May 30th, the first missile struck the center of the formation. The explosion ripped through the forest floor, hurling bodies and earth alike. Chaos erupted. Screams, running, trees splintered and cracked under the weight of shock. But this was not a single blow. It was a pattern designed to break the will, not just the formation. As survivors scattered into smaller groups, more drones followed. Precision strikes tracked their movement under the trees, turning every shadow into a trap. The jungle, once their cover, had become their cage. For the first time in years, it was not the villagers who fled in panic. It was the insurgents. On the ground, elite reconnaissance teams advanced slowly, verifying targets, securing perimeter zones, recovering weapons. Among the debris, soldiers found maps, communications gear, and a crude, hand-drawn schedule for an attack set for June 2nd. That attack would never happen. By nightfall, the tri-border forest, long considered a lawless haven, was quiet. Fires smoldered where once drums of fuel had sat. Ammunition cracked gently underfoot. And the air, though thick with smoke, carried something else: finality. But even in war, there are moments that pause time. Just before midnight, at the eastern edge of the cleared zone, a lone figure emerged, his clothes-torn rifle held above his head. He walked slowly barefoot towards the forward line of Burkina Faso's forces. He did not run. He did not speak at first, but when he finally reached the first soldier, he collapsed to his knees and cried. "I can't take it anymore," he said in broken voice. "We're finished. The sky, it doesn't sleep." He wasn't alone. In the days that followed, more weapons were found abandoned in the brush. More footprints, bare, hurried, leading nowhere. Fear had changed sides. And in the homes of ordinary people, those who had waited years for protection, the news arrived not in reports, but in relief. A mother in Seba said to her neighbor, "I used to tell my son not to look out the window. Now I open the door first." In a dusty classroom, a teacher wrote a new word on the blackboard for his students: reclaim. And in the forest, as ash settled into soil and silence claimed the battlefield, a new thought began to take root, not just in the minds of soldiers or commanders, but in the hearts of a weary people. We are no longer running. My child used to cry at the sound of gunfire. Now he sleeps soundly beside the uniform his father left behind. These were the words of Fanta, a mother of 3 in the village of Sendo. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes held something unshakable. Not pride, not anger. Something older than both dignity. The war was no longer confined to soldiers in boots or officers behind maps. It had come to the doorstep of the people, and instead of retreating, the people had opened the door. In Mani, women gathered before dawn to cook for passing battalions. Their pots clanked like war drums filled not with metal, but with millet fish and hope. Elders sat outside huts, watching the road, noting faces, movements, even the twitch of a donkey's ear. Teenagers, once lost to idle fear, now volunteered to carry supplies, clear paths, and stand watch at village perimeters. It did not happen all at once. But slowly, steadily, something ancient awakened. From Sendo to Mani, people began to speak not just of defense, but of belonging. They were no longer waiting for the army. They had become part of it. Local defense units, once disorganized, poorly equipped, were now brimming with resolve. Villagers formed barricades out of carts and crates, laying sandbags near water points. When infiltrators attempted to slip through narrow trails at night, they were met not by silence, but by resistance. Armed or not, the message was clear. This land remembers its name. In one village, after a successful repelling of attackers, the people gathered to celebrate, not with dancing, but with stories. One elder raised his voice before the firelight. "When we were children, we knew the names of our rivers, our trees, our songs. Then the guns came and we forgot. But now we remember." A new tradition emerged. Photographs of Captain Traoré began appearing on the walls of mud brick homes. Not out of political loyalty, but out of reverence. Some families placed candles beneath his image. Others named newborn sons after him. "He doesn't just wear a uniform," one woman said, "he wears our hopes." In the village of Gondi, a 6-year-old boy stood at attention each morning, saluting the local militia commander as he passed. No one had taught him. He simply watched and learned. Meanwhile, in a small mosque near the hills of Sando, elders prayed by name for soldiers stationed in the east. They called each battalion as if calling sons to dinner, gentle, proud, unyielding. The spirit of the people had changed, no longer waiting, no longer whispering. Fathers once afraid to return now came home, some with bandages, others with medals, all with stories. One such story came from Corporal Amadou, a member of the 25th Battalion. Standing before a crowd in Mani, he said softly, "Before, when we entered villages, they watched us like strangers. Now they run to us like sons." His voice cracked on the last word. Around him, no one spoke. They didn't have to, because everyone there had already felt it. The turning of the tide wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the kitchen, the classroom, the well, the fire pit. At dusk that evening, as smoke curled from the last cooking fires and stars blinked above the silent bush, an old man sat alone outside his hut. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "We once had Sankara. Now, we have Traoré." Across the plains of Burkina Faso, the morning no longer whispered of fear. It sang. Villages that once cowered in silence now stirred with soft hymns, voices rising over cooking fires and rustling trees. In places where the soil had once soaked with loss, children now chased one another barefoot, laughter trailing behind them like banners in the wind. The battles had ended, but the story had not. From Kana to Seba, every bullet fired, every missile launched, every soldier returned, carried a piece of something larger, not just a victory, but a reclamation. A reclamation of pride, of memory, of home. In Wahiguya, a group of young recruits barely 18 stood beneath the flag during morning formation. Their boots were new, their eyes were not. They had seen what had come before, and they had chosen not to run. One of them, Issouf, spoke to his grandmother the night before his departure. She held his hand tightly and said, "We are not made to disappear. Our name must remain." He nodded. And when he left, he carried more than his uniform, he carried her story. In village after village, soldiers no longer entered as strangers. They were greeted like sons come home. Baskets of yams, bowls of water, songs sung with cracked voices and weathered palms. It was not ceremony, it was belonging. Near the edge of the Jibo forest, a group of veterans gathered. Gray hair, scarred arms, some walking with canes. They sat in a circle beneath the trees and shared silence, first, then stories. One man, a former radio operator, spoke of Captain Traoré. He didn't promise us miracles. He gave us something rarer. He gave us a reason to believe again. Others nodded. They remembered a time when Sankara walked these lands, when boldness wore no mask, when the land itself felt younger. But now, something had returned. Not the same man, not the same decade, but the same fire. Traoré had spoken not with speeches, but with action. He had chosen no alliances but his people, and the people had answered. In the capital, posters bearing his face were not adorned with slogans, but with single words: dignity, resolve, home. On a small chalkboard in a rural school, a teacher wrote, "Burkina Faso, the land of upright men," then added beneath it, "and women who do not kneel." As the sun dipped low, casting long gold shadows across the land, a caravan of returning troops passed through Kana, the place where it all began. This time there were no weapons drawn, no eyes darting at the tree line, just smiles, handshakes. A boy held up a homemade sign, "Welcome home, sons." Captain Traoré was not there. He rarely was. But his presence lingered stitched into every flag, every recovered village, every whispered prayer over evening stew. And in homes lit by oil lamps, families sat close and told their children of what had happened. Not to frighten them, but to teach them. Because remembering is not a ritual. It is a duty. If the French remember Charles de Gaulle, If Americans still honor the name Martin Luther King, then we sons and daughters of this soil must remember Sankara, and now we must also remember Traoré, not just with words, but with actions, by standing when others sit, by speaking when silence is demanded, by protecting what is ours not from hatred, but from love. The war is not only about guns, it never was, it is about the soul of a nation. And that soul, thanks to courage, sacrifice, and truth, now burns bright.